to History Class with Dr. W. and our discussion of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In the previous lecture, I talked about the phenomenon of the New South, bringing industry and manufacturing into the South in the decades following the Civil War. In this lecture, I'll continue that discussion of the New South, focusing on some of the cultural and social legacies of that era, and the continuing legacy of the Old South and some of the Civil War phenomenon. In previous lectures, I've discussed the idea of sharecropping at some length, and it's important to note that while the idea of the New South and manufacturing and industry did play a prominent role in the post-Civil War era, it remained by far an overwhelmingly agricultural region, and sharecropping was one of the predominant forms of labor and the economy throughout the South and throughout this entire period. It really wasn't until several decades into the 20th century and the Great Migration of the World War I era that we began to see large numbers of the formerly freed slaves and African Americans leaving the South and sharecropping finally beginning to tumble. It remained in existence, though, in some pockets of the South well into the 1960s. While some Southerners embraced the idea of moving forward in the years after the Civil War, the sense of nostalgia for the antebellum South remained strong. Many Southerners clung to an idea that came to be called the lost cause, the idea that the South had fought nobly in the war, and that the Civil War in fact had not been fought over slavery, but on other issues such as states' rights. The painting at the bottom of the screen here is actually a painting called The Lost Cause from 1869 and depicts the sacrifice that was made by Southern veterans during the war. On both sides, North and South, memories of the war were kept alive for decades by veteran societies. Maimed and crippled former soldiers walked the streets and roamed the countryside for decades after the war ended. By 1885, the Grand Army of the Republic, a Northern Veteran Society, had over 5,000 chapters and over 300,000 members nationwide. Every year, cities hosted veterans encampments, which only got bigger as the war receded into the past. In 1896, a reunion of Confederate veterans in Richmond, Virginia, was front-page news for weeks and drew over 10,000 veterans and 90,000 spectators. For decades, war veterans commanded special respect in politics at all levels. In many cases, their war record mattered not, as incompetent officers won spectacular electoral victories. Both sides recalled old loyalties to strengthen their cause. For Northern Republicans, this was known as waving the bloody shirt, making any sort of emotional appeal of North versus South. Here's one example from a political speech of the era. Every unregenerate rebel calls himself a Democrat. Every bounty jumper, every deserter, every sneak who ran away from the draft, who murdered Union prisoners, who contrived hellish schemes to introduce into northern cities the wasting pestilence of yellow fever, everyone who shoots down Negroes in the streets, burns Negro schoolhouses and meeting houses, and murders women and children by the light of their flaming dwellings, calls himself a Democrat. Another sign of the lingering memory of the Civil War was the extensive pension plan. Congressmen in the decades after the war dared not vote down such measures, and veterans, particularly of the Union side, could apply for aid based on all sorts of reasons. Virtually all received it. Pensions took up 21% of the federal budget in 1880, and more than 40% by 1893. Memorial Day, first observed in 1868, was a major holiday during this period. And women across the country, but particularly Southern women, led the movement to erect monuments and statues, honoring the valiant husbands, sons, and fathers who had fought during the war, particularly on the Confederate side. During this era, thousands of monuments and statues were constructed honoring Confederate soldiers. In an odd way, such recollections of the past served to reconcile and reunite the country. Both sides could respect and appreciate the sacrifices of those who served and died. Both could appreciate the great generalship of men like Robert E. Lee, who before he died was embraced in both North and South. Misty-eyed veterans could shake the hands of their former rivals and recall their war experiences. In one such instance, a Confederate veteran told of his experiences to an audience in Carnegie Hall. When he finished, he was approached by the father of a dead Union soldier, hand outstretched, who said, "I have hated you for more than 30 years. I will never hate you any more." With time, the divisive issues that caused the Civil War faded from memory, replaced with a national pride in the sacrifice of the soldiers. In focusing on the past, both North and South thought less about the future, and especially about the place in this country for the former slaves. Preferring the nostalgia of the good old days, in some sense, Americans were willing to recreate that social system rather than replacing it with new and better ways. We've spent some time examining the country in different regions in the years after the Civil War. South, West, and North. Let's talk a little bit about things that brought all of these regions together. If there's a consistent theme tying together East and West, North and South in this country after the Civil War, it is the development of fossil fuels and the vast changes that such development meant for Americans in all regions. In this period, the physical effort of animals, humans, wood, and water came to be replaced by coal-fired steam engines, petroleum, and electricity. Railroads and fossil fuels brought urbanization and industry to every region of the country. The South, once almost entirely rural, witnessed the growth of hubs like Atlanta, Louisville, and the Iron City of Birmingham. In the West, the refining and smelting center of Denver and the shipping hub of San Francisco flourished. In the Midwest, coal and manufacturing led to the evolution of cities like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and Cleveland. Even lesser-known cities like Trenton, New Jersey, and Schenectady, New York, enjoyed boom times during this period. Chicago lay at the center of this evolution and represents perhaps the best example of urban growth in this period. The city benefited from nearby deposits of coal, from its position as a railroad hub, and its key role as a meat processing site at the end of the rail lines for many cattlemen. Its population exploded from about 30,000 in 1860 to over 2 million by 1900. In 1893, it hosted an astonishing World's Fair. Mechanization had a profound impact in the countryside as well. Technology greatly benefited agricultural workers. Steam-powered grain threshers, corn huskers, sugar mills, cotton presses, and dairy processors appeared, making giants of companies like McCormick and John Deere. Large companies able to consolidate control of certain industries became household names during this period. The Pillsbury Company of Minneapolis cornered the wheat market and became the dominant flour company. Quaker Oats, Campbell's Soup, Hershey's Chocolate, and Heinz Ketchup all arrived during this era. The meatpacking industry perhaps best represents this move towards mechanization and increased efficiency. Railroads shipped the cattle and hogs to feedlots for fattening, then to centralized slaughtering facilities. By the 1870s, Chicago's Union stockyards killed and processed more than 1 million hogs a year for various pork products. The British author Rudyard Kipling found the process disturbing. He wrote, On the slaughterhouse floor, the hog's full-voiced shriek became a sputter, and then a fall, as of heavy tropical rain. The blood ran in muttering gutters. There was no place for hand or foot that was not coated with thickness of dried blood, and the stench of it in the nostrils bred fear. The advances of this era paved the way for giants of industry, such as Carnegie in the steel industry, Rockefeller in oil, and Jay Cooke and J.P. Morgan in banking. There were half a dozen similarly influential figures in the railroad industry alone. Industry grew at such an alarming rate that a new phrase came to describe the most expansive of the companies: multinational. A handful of companies took their successes to markets around the world. Among the first was the Singer sewing machine, which began exporting sewing machines prior to the Civil War to Scotland and Ireland, and by 1900 had markets all around the world. Other multinational companies soon coming on the scene included Bell Telephone, Eastman Kodak, Standard Oil, and dozens of others. It is to the phenomenon of urbanization and industrialization that we'll turn over our next few lectures.